do you think you'd have the same career as you have had if you were starting out now?
No, not at all. Not at all. No, not at all. I don't know that I would be able to get a show on. I really don't. If I could have been a playwright, I would have been a playwright. I don't mind writing a musical that doesn't work as long as I have a good time writing it, as long as I think it was worth trying. That musical was not worth trying, so I don't like that one. I would have probably ended up, though, as a mathematician. That was my love. My love was mathematics. I don't think any big hit has ever gotten on by the author sitting down and say, okay, now what is popular these days? I know dogs are popular and nuns are popular. Let's write a show about a nun and a dog. It never works. You cannot predict what an audience will like or dislike. All you can do is try to make the work as good and write for yourself. The depersonalization of the world is particularly for people of my generation is pretty frightening, of the constant barrage of information and what that does to people's sense of identity and what that does to people's sense of community. I think we live in an era where community is breaking down and becoming isolated shards. I'd rather have an audience like what I write than dislike what I write. But primarily I want to write, so that's what counts.
Can I ask, first of all, before we go any further, how would you like to be credited on screen? Composer and lyricist, or?
Oh, goodness gracious, yes.
Brilliant.
Sorry.
Reading your book, it was quite interesting to me. One of your fundamental principles, you say, is less is more. Mm-hmm. Have you always abided by this principle?
Ever since I came across the idea, yes, I have. I think I learned it really from Oscar Hammerstein, who taught me most of what I know, because his work is very spare, both the good and the bad work. It's always spare, and I think I learned it by osmosis before I ever read that. I think it was Mies van der Rohe who said it. And then when it was put into print, I thought, yes, that's absolutely true.
Why is it so true?
Well, incidentally, it's not always true. In the case of War and Peace, less is not more. More is more there. But I think for short forms particularly, the leaner you can be, the less padded you can be, the better it is, and the more direct you can get.
You mentioned Oscar Hammerstein as your mentor. Have you ever found the need to pass on the knowledge that you've learned to a protege of your own?
Yes, it's one of the reasons I wrote this book. But a particular protege, yeah, I did some of that for Jonathan Larson, the man who wrote Rent, and for a team named Richard Maltby and David Shire, who have written a number of shows and songs, and I've done it to classes, to groups of people, but those are the only specific individuals I did.
So was your primary motivation for writing the book that you wanted to pass on your own
No,
knowledge?
the primary motivation was I was asked to do a book of collected lyrics, and I said, oh well, if I could write some essays about lyric writing, and to my horror, the publisher said yes. And so I had to go ahead and do it, and so that's how I got into it. That was 14 years ago, and I was able to put it off for 11 years, and then finally I got guilty, so I did it.
There's a memorable passage in the book where you talk about not being happy with your work for West Side Story. And actually, if I can quote back at you, you say that some of your lyrics melt in the mouth as gracelessly as peanut butter and are impossible to comprehend.
Yes.
Wasn't that bad, surely?
Well, surely it is. If you try to hear the lyric of America and really, and you've never heard it before, I think half of it would escape your attention. It's so jammed, and it's so filled with rhymes, and it's very fast, and that's the primary example. But there are others.
So why did you write it like that? Was it an experience?
No, it was partly because the music was. I had to sort of fit lyrics to the music because it was a tune that Lenny had written for a ballet when he was a very young man that had never been used. And it's the kind of tune that ordinarily I would not write a lyric to because it is so jammed together, and particularly if you're going to do rhymes and try to make jokes at the same time. It's also, if I had spent more time on it, I might have been able to improve it. And actually, I didn't realize until I heard singers do it how difficult it was to understand. When I used to do it at the piano, that would be, I could understand what I was saying, but I'm not sure that I wouldn't have changed it if I'd heard it sung earlier.
Now, West Side Story to one side, your work's often held up as being much more intelligent than the average work of musical theatre. Why do you think that musical theatre as a genre has produced so much kind of light and sometimes quite dumb work?
Well, it's been less true in the last 40 years, I'd say. It was Oscar Hammerstein who actually introduced the idea of intelligence into musical comedy with Showboat, which was a serious show, but it was a musical. And what he had done was he had amalgamated the European tradition of operetta with the American lighthearted musical comedy. But under his hands, and between that and Oklahoma, he revolutionized the American musical theater so that a whole generation, my generation, were able to bring something of a genuine feeling for story, for character, and what you would call intelligence to musicals. But that really all happened after the Second World War because of Hammerstein's revolution.
So what do you hope will be your legacy? How have you moved it on since Oscar Hammerstein?
I can't take a bird's eye view.
Okay. What do you think of the state of musical theatre at the moment?
Well, it's the problem with musical theatre at the moment has been the problem that's been around for now, 40 years, which is economics. It's young people do not get a chance to learn their craft. Even when I was young and learning my craft, we at the most you could get on a show maybe every 2 years. The generation before me, Hammerstein's generation, the generation of Rodgers and Hart, of Cole Porter, of all the people who were the pioneers, so to speak, in American musicals, they did 2 shows a season. So they got to learn their craft, because you only learn by doing. It's not a craft that can be, it's a practical craft. It's not a craft that can really be learned in a classroom. You can learn principles, but the whole idea of the theater is, and includes playwriting too, is you have to get it out in front of an audience and get that two-way street going between an audience and a stage, and see what happens when performers get hold of what you write. That can only be done by practice. And unless you get a chance to practice, you can't, quote, be perfect. And now, young writers are lucky if they get a show on every 5 years. And that's really lucky. There's no way for them to learn their craft. So what's happened is that shows now do not depend on young writers as much as they do on tried and true material. I mean, that's the so-called jukebox musicals, the musicals like Mamma Mia, which are collections of songs that are already known to the public, that have been pre-written, so to speak. And then there are the musicals that make fun of musicals.
The meta-musicals.
What we call meta-musicals, or as a friend of mine says, the musicals that eat their young. And, and it's in which you make fun, and that's college level stuff. I mean, making fun of what you're writing is nothing more than college, and nothing less either. And there's room for college musicals. But musicals that really try to do something, or say something, or try to experiment with the form are few and far between. Now, you find them often in what you'd call over here fringe theater, in off-Broadway theater, in regional theater. But they don't get the kind of exposure, nor do they get the kind of professional productions, unless they are done on Broadway or in the West End, with professional singers and professional actors and professional directors, and a wide audience. And so it's not exactly a dead-end street, but it's a very narrow tunnel to get to write something and to get it heard by a large number of people, and heard properly.
And you say that economics is the main factor behind this.
Yes, sure, because a producer has to now, in America, musicals now, the average musical costs $12 to $15 million. And now granted, the value of money has changed, but West Side Story was done for $300,000, and that was considered an average price at the time that it was done. That was 1957. And also there were many more shows done. But musicals are so expensive now that producers are unwilling to take a chance on an unknown, unless they're writing a musical adaptation of a property that comes with a built-in. Say, if you do a Harry Potter musical, yes, they might give a chance to a young person to write a Harry Potter musical because they've got Harry Potter to sell the tickets. Otherwise, they want either, as I say, songs that the audience already knows, that they think will attract a show that will attract a crowd because of the audience knowing and feeling comfortable with the songs already.
I tell you what then, do you think you'd have the same career as you have had if you were starting out now?
No, not at all, not at all, no, not at all. I don't know that I would be able to get a show on. I really don't. I mean, if I were writing the kind of stuff I like to write. And I mean, even West Side Story was very hard to get on, and because it was, in a sense, experimental, and yet Bernstein was well known, and Jerry Robbins was well known, and Arthur Lawrence was experienced, and but it was still difficult to In fact, our first producer, we were doing backers auditions, and then she decided to drop the show, and we raised not a cent. We couldn't raise a cent.
I'll tell you what, you're quoting lots of Broadway names to us here, and you are thought of as being a very American figure, but at the same time, British theatre's had a big impact on your career, hasn't it?
Yes, well, yes. I've always been, first of all, I've always been an Anglophile ever since I came over here in 1958 to do West Side Story, and I thought, I love this country, and I love the theater here too, because the theater is so based on words, and it's so verbally felicitous, and the love of language that's in the theater here. Not that American theater doesn't love language, but nothing like what the British do. And as I've said often, the first good reviews I ever got were for Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum over here, because it's filled with wordplay.
Well, it's interesting that recently, in the last couple of years, there's been a lot more revivals of your work, more than ever, probably. Yes. Why, specifically here in London, and a lot of them transferring to Broadway.
Yes, indeed.
What do you think is going on at the moment? Why is this happening now?
I don't know why it's happening now. I do know that the shows that I've been connected with generally have really first-rate books, and therefore they're shows that are worth reviving. They're interesting enough so that a young director or a group of actors can, quote, reinterpret the thing and have a good time doing it. So I think the shows that I've written attract directors, and it needs a kind of the thrust of a director's desire to do it to interest, let's say, a producer or a theater like the Menya Chocolates Factory, which have done a number of my shows. And you know, and I've had a number of shows done at the National Theater, which is both an honor as far as I'm concerned, but it's because there are directors who thought this would be interesting to do. I'd like to do this in that kind of venue. That's
a very modest answer. You don't think there's something in the air at the moment which is compatible with a Sondheim sensibility? It's
possible, but you know, that's a romantic idea, and I'll accept it, but it's not something that occurs to me now.
I tell you what, we're talking about the differences between British and American theatre. Our government are currently telling us that our theatre, we have to adapt to be more like the American model. What do you think of this proposal?
Well, first of all, I don't know if you know and if your audience knows, but there is no such thing as government subsidy of what you call commercial theatre in the United States. In fact, there's very little subsidy of the arts at all. When I was on the National Endowment of the Arts over there, we discovered that the city of Vienna subsidizes its opera. It's a greater subsidy for its opera than all the subsidies that the government did for all arts in the United States. So it's always, the theater particularly has always been commercially based. You raise the money, you go out, hat in hand, you go out to individual donors and that type. Now you can't even do that because musicals are so expensive, theater is so expensive, plays are, that you have to get corporation money. You have to go to I don't know, a movie studio, or large corporations have to put money into shows because individuals can't do it anymore. When a show costs $15 million, you can't go out to 15 millionaires and ask each of them for $1 million because you won't get it. And the result is that there's less work, of course, but we have never been subsidized. I'm so sorry to hear, I'm not surprised considering what's going on economically all over the world, but I'm really sorry to hear that the government is cutting back on their subsidies. I can understand why, but I deplore it. It's too bad.
What do you think? Well, do you think British theatre will suffer if we're made to follow more of an American model?
Well, I think there'll be less of it, and it'll be more commercialized. That is, say, the more surefire things. Look, it's been happening anyway. When you look down the list of what's playing in the West End, in the commercial theatre, it's 90% musicals. When I first came to Great Britain, I'd say it was maybe 1 in 8 shows was a musical that was playing in the West End. Everything was plays. Whereas already in the United States, most of the shows were musicals. And I saw what was happening 35 years ago, and I said, London is going to become like New York. New York 35 years ago was mostly musicals. I said, in 10 years, London will be mostly musicals. And sure enough, in 10 years, London was mostly musicals. And now it's almost entirely musicals. And so musicals being by nature more popular with a general audience, they're going to, like kudzu, the weed that grows all over the place, are going to take over and have taken over, in fact. But they're expensive.
But for a man who's made his career working in musicals, is this not a good thing?
And, well, I think it's a terrible thing, but on the other hand, I think it's much worse that plays aren't being done. I mean, if I could have been a playwright, I would have been a playwright. And it's not that so much that I prefer plays to musicals, although I do in terms of quality. And when I come over here, I see the plays. I do not see the musicals, because whatever plays I can find are more interesting generally than the musicals. And that is true in New York too. I rarely go to musicals in New York unless I really hear something interesting about them.
How different do you think the work is that's being produced on the in the West End, say, as opposed to on Broadway?
Well, not an awful lot of difference. And
you mentioned the word thing earlier. I'm just wondering whether our theatre is a bit more intelligent than in.
Well, it's a little that kind of generalization is hard to make. Also, because so few plays are being done, I'm afraid that there isn't a lot of difference between London and New York now.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's a bad thing.
And how about not just the work, but the accessibility of the work? Because theatre tickets on Broadway are much more expensive than they are in the West End, for example.
I don't know enough about the pricing in the West End. What would you say the average price is over here?
Well, it's about £40, £50.
All right, that would be $80. And our average price now is $110. You're catching up.
Looking back now, which of your musicals are you most proud of?
Oh, I like each of them for a different reason. I've been asked that before. I like the only musical that I've written that I'm sorry I took the time to write, and I cover this in the book, is a musical called Do I Hear a Waltz, which is not a bad musical. It's just a musical that need not have been written. And because I don't mind writing a musical that doesn't work as long as I have a good time writing it, as long as I think it was worth trying. That musical was not worth trying, so I don't like that one. But for every single other one, there are, even West Side Story, where I don't like my own work, but I'm proud to be connected with the show because the show itself is wonderful. And that's what counts. And that was worth writing. And certainly of my largest commercial failures, I can tell you what I like about them. There's something I like about all of them.
In the book, you quote William Faulkner's theory that a writer needs three things: experience, observation, imagination. Which of the three do you have the most of?
Well, the thing I didn't have a lot of, and what made me, I'd always thought that Shaw had said that, but I found out recently that it was something Faulkner said. He went on to say that you can do without one of the three qualities, but you can't do without two of them. That in order to be a writer, you have to have two out of the three. And I had no experience, but I had a lot of imagination and decent observation. So those are my two strong points of the three.
You haven't written anything new for a while. Are you going to write anything new?
Well, I did. The last show was actually only 3 years ago. It was called Road Show. It was a development of a show that originally had been called Wise Guys and then was called Bounce. But it took a number of years to write and rewrite and rewrite. And by that time, I was obligated to do this book. So I've spent the last couple of years doing the book because there's a second volume coming out. You know, this book is only lyrics up until I met James Lapine. We started with Sunday in the Park with George. I've written about 2/3 of the second volume, but I've got to finish that, and then I'll get back to the piano. I do miss writing music, but I can only do one thing at a time. I'm a slow writer.
There's a really moving passage in the book when you talk about how you've always enjoyed working with theatre as it provided you with a family, which you didn't feel that you had that sense of family beforehand.
No. I grew up as an only child, and I had two working parents. And so I didn't see much of my parents. I was sent to boarding schools very, very early on. And I just figured that every other kid was like that, except my best friend had a sister. And I thought, gee, wouldn't it be nice to have a brother or a sister? Anyway, what I get when I work with a collaborator, a writing collaborator, is I do get that sense of having a brother. And when I work with a group of people putting on a show, then it becomes a director and some actors, it is a family. And we're all in the same boat together. We're all striving for something, and we're all trying to make connections with each other and make something larger than we are individually. And that's a family feeling to me.
If you'd had more of a family feeling when you were growing up, do you think you would have ended up as a teacher or an accountant?
Oh, not an accountant. I would have probably ended up, though, as a mathematician. That was my love. My love was mathematics. And on the other hand, it was falling into the orbit of Oscar Hammerstein that made me a songwriter. I wouldn't have been a songwriter if I don't think if I hadn't just accidentally at the age of 11 met him.
The main criticism that's been levelled at your work over the years, perhaps the only criticism, is that it's cold, and it's something that you acknowledge in the book.
Well, I don't. What do I? What I don't think I say that it's cold.
No, you don't. You don't say that you agree with it, but you acknowledge that that's the
Oh,
criticism.
yes, sure. Oh, sure.
And I was going to ask, is there any substance to this criticism?
No. First of all, it's interesting, and one of the things that I did not actually say in the book, but I think I will in the second volume, is that the shows that have been accused of being cold are the ones that I did with Hal Prince. They are more, I'd say, dispassionate than the ones that I did with James Lapine and later with John Weidman. And I think there is a certain objectivity, a certain removal in them. I don't think they're cold, but they are more dispassionate. They are anti-sentimental. And I think that's one of the things that people are talking about. Also, I think people I think there's a confusion. I think they think cold equals cerebral, or cerebral equals cold. Cerebral equals, to bring up your word, intelligent. And that's not what people really wanted music. They want not to think, or they want not to be moved in a way. I think that the people who accuse the musicals of being cold may also be people who either they. No, I think I will censor that remark. I think I will not make a generalization. But
you do. So you've acknowledged that people, when they go to the musicals, want not to think.
Many do. I think that's not true, and that's why I was censoring, because things have changed. Things have changed. I think a lot of people go to musicals now that sound interesting. I think still the majority of musicals want to go to and have a mindless evening. I think there's no question.
So how has an awareness of that impacted on your work when you've been writing?
Oh, it never does. It never does. I think. Oh gosh, no. I think that's a fool's game. To try, first of all, in any way, to try to predict what an audience's reaction is going to be. I don't think any big hit has ever gotten on by the author sitting down and say, okay, now what is popular these days? I know dogs are popular and nuns are popular. Let's write a show about a nun and a dog. It never works. You cannot predict what an audience will like or dislike. All you can do is try to make the work as good and write for yourself. I can guarantee you, without naming the shows, that some of the shows that I think are really terrible, that have become huge hits, the people who wrote them thought they were good and sat down because they loved what they were writing. Anybody who sits down and tries to predict what an audience will like is going to waste 2 years or 6 months of his time.
I'll tell you what, you do also say in the book that you think the need for live theatre, you never doubted that it would always be around. You're starting to doubt that it will.
Well, it's pretty frightening. The way the depersonalization of the world is particularly for people of my generation is pretty frightening. I mean, I wouldn't feel that I wouldn't care either if I were growing up now. When you grow up in a world of cyberspace and of the constant barrage of information and what that does to people's sense of identity and what that does to people's sense of community. It's and theater's a communal idea, and I think we live in an era where community is breaking down and becoming isolated shards, and so it isn't. I think, on the other hand, I think I probably exaggerate, because I think people will always, particularly kids, let's say in school, the fun of putting on a play is always going to be there. I think the business of dressing up and pretending to be somebody else and singing and dancing or doing dramatic scenes is always going to be with us. Whether it's going to still be in any way a popular art, it's become a marginalized art anyway. It used to be the only game in town up until the middle of the 20th century, when suddenly television started, and then suddenly theater got less and less to be the game in town, and television got to be, and that's a removed electric kind of entertainment. And
well, the other thing, I suppose you could say that as the world becomes more depersonalized, there's more of a need for that special live experience. I mean, that's what's happening with recorded music, for example, that the live gig has become more special.
Maybe so. I don't know. It's the live gig is there's a circus atmosphere to the so-called live gig, and spectacle, of course, is something that rock concerts trade in, and the need for spectacle, bread and circuses. But I'm afraid that I think bread is going out the window, and I think circuses are the only thing left, or may be the only thing left. I just think that the need, you talk about the need, that's what I was addressing, that the need may lessen, and that upsets me.
Okay, finally, during the course of your career, you've won 8 Tonys, several Grammys, an Oscar and a Pulitzer Prize. Do you have any as yet unfulfilled ambitions?
No. And I wasn't ambitious for those either. The first Tony, I was really pleased with myself. I just thought, oh, this is wonderful to get an award this way. But you know, once you've gotten the award, you say, that's it, so that's it. So it's nice to get an award. It's nice to be recognized, just the way I'd rather have an audience like what I write than dislike what I write. But primarily I want to write, so, you know, that's what counts.